Hello, I'm Kathleen Barnes of Take Charge Books. I've been passionate about natural health for all of my adult life, and I'm the author of several natural health books myself, including 8 Weeks to Vibrant Health with Dr. Hyla Cass, and The Calcium Lie, What Your Doctor Doesn't Know Might Kill You with Dr. Robert Thompson. So when I met Dr. Jim Crawford, author of A Stroke Was My Teacher, I knew that he had a really important message to convey about the causes of stroke and some really new thinking about it. I've truly enjoyed my time talking with him, and I hope you'll enjoy it too. Thanks for joining us. Welcome. I'm Kathleen Barnes from Take Charge Books, and today we have the honor to have some time with Dr. Jim Crawford, who is the author of A Stroke Was My Teacher. It's a fascinating book, and you've got some really fascinating insights into a problem that so many people are experiencing. So tell us a little bit about your background, Dr. Crawford.
Kathleen, I have a 50-year career in biomedical research. After I graduated from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, I then went to the National Institutes of Health, and I was there for 2 years. And then following that, I went on to a career with Pfizer Pharmaceutical, where I was a research director for them for 35 years. And I was a member of the team who was first to make live polio vaccine at commercial scale. That's where it all began. And so I've had a career in vaccines, antibiotic production, antibiotic development, numerous biologicals, all made by fermentation processes. And that's where I've invested most of my life. I've also had experience teaching at Indiana State University as an adjunct professor, and after retirement, I spent 4 years working on Alzheimer's disease. So I published a couple papers on Alzheimer's disease. And then, a few years later, I incurred a stroke, an embolic stroke, and so it was a short step for me to start keeping track of the science of the stroke, because that's what I had been doing all my life on other scientific matters. So I started recording my experience with the intent of writing a book to be helpful to those who experience the same problem. And that's what I have produced in the book that you have in front of you.
So you became your own research subject, really.
Oh, absolutely. And boy, if you don't think my wife doesn't realize that. Yeah, because it's exactly what I was my own guinea pig. And I intentionally used different modalities for treating stroke. Even though I might not believe in them, I intentionally invested time and energy into them to evaluate them for the purpose of this book. And in the book I detail there must be a dozen different modalities that I evaluated to give the public, at least my opinion, of those that were useful and those that were a waste of time and money. So that's part of my strategy. And since I've had my stroke, I have evaluated numerous nutraceuticals and things of that nature, vitamins, supplements, minerals, and so on, to see whether the claims that are made for them have any validity. And so I have documented what I have found was useful. And in fact, peripheral to stroke, there have been several nutraceuticals that I have found extremely valuable. And one of the most valuable of all, and I want to touch back on it later in my talk, is on magnesium and its relationship to numerous diseases, magnesium deficiency, and I'll take that up a little later.
Great.
But that's a very, very important area.
Well, let's talk a little bit, for those who don't know, exactly what is a stroke? What happens when you're having a stroke?
There are several types of stroke. The type I had was called an embolic stroke, of which about 80% of all strokes are called embolic, which means that you have floating in your bloodstream, or did have, either a clot, which was formed from the plaque or the material that broke loose from a plaque in your arteries, or you have plaque material itself. You got plaque material or clot So anything that's floating around there is called an embolism, and sometimes they will form multiple lesions in your brain. Mine was called an embolic shower because I had so many of them. But very fortunately, none of them hit the really crucial areas affecting speech or thought or whatever. You know, I was very, very lucky for that to have happened with those minor, relatively minor consequences, because what my main symptom would be what's called hemiparesis, or partial paralysis of the left side of my body, meaning the stroke occurred on the right side of my brain. So that was very, very fortuitous for me, because I was left with relatively minor damage. But as we'll talk about a little later too, there are some accepted symptoms of stroke, and there's some surprises as well, some unanticipated. And I'll be dealing with those as well.
Well, tell us a little bit about your stroke and what happened. What were your symptoms, and how did you know you were having one?
Okay, now that's really interesting story. To me, it was interesting, and it should be to the general public, because the first indication of a stroke I had was unlike anything written in the medical literature. You know, the general features of stroke as written in the Stroke Association, the Heart Association, National Institutes of Health, and those sources of information, is that there is this acronym called FAST, which is face, arms, speech, time. Okay, so one of the first signs of stroke is if you have facial distortion, F. The second is A, as arms. Can you lift your arms normally and naturally? If you cannot, that can be a sign of stroke. S is speech, and that is certainly a sign of stroke, because whereas my first warning stroke, which is usually called a TIA, which is a very, very poor term, but anyway, my very first one was unlike anything I'd seen in the literature, my first warning stroke. I was driving down the highway between Terre Haute, Indiana, and Indianapolis, Indiana, and my left arm felt like it was floating in the air. That's nothing like anybody has ever described, to my knowledge, about a stroke. My arm felt like it was floating. And I knew at the time that was too strange to be ignored, but I ignored it anyway, because it went away after about an hour, you know, and that often happens with stroke. The warning strokes go away after an hour or so, certainly within 24 hours. So you dismiss them from your mind, but that never left my mind, because a couple years later, when I was cutting grass in Florida, my left leg began to drag, and I knew immediately what was going on there, because that is a very typical sign of stroke. So that was no surprise. I just packed myself off to the emergency room, and that's an interesting story in itself, because I get to the emergency room, and the admitting clerk asked me why I'm there, and I said, well, I'm having a problem with my gait. And that was a big mistake, because she did not know what I was talking about. Well, what it meant was that I'm having trouble walking, but she did not understand that. And she said, well, you go back to the waiting room and I'll call you. So I went back, and after 15 minutes, I decided to get up and go tell her again, look, I think I'm having symptoms of a stroke. And that got their attention. So they whisked me in there for the MRIs, the CAT scans, and all that. And so they really got their attention when they knew that this was a symptom of stroke. But it was surprising that the person at the admitting desk at the emergency room in the hospital did not know what I talked about when I said I had a problem with my gait.
She thought you had a problem with your garden gate.
Exactly.
So we'll continue in the next segment. We're running out of time here, but thank you so much, Dr. Jim Crawford, author of A Stroke Was My Teacher.
Okay.